read this here presently, and then we'll talk about it. But before we do either of those things, as we usually do, we'll stop, we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. So if you'd pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this world that you have made for us, this existence that we have, Father. We know that everything that we have, down to our very existence, is due to you and is dependent upon you. We are grateful, Father, for your continued care, your love, your mercy, and your grace. We ask that you would bless us at this time as we study from your word. We ask that you would help us in our understanding of it and in the application of it, that the lives we lead, the things we say and the things that we do may be things that are in accordance with your will and bring you greater glory. We are, Father, thankful most of all and most grateful that you sent your Son Jesus as a Redeemer, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. All right. Psalm 63. A psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, you are my God. Earnestly will I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you, in a dry and weary land where no water is. So have I looked upon you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. So will I bless you while I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise you with joyful lips. When I remember you upon my bed, meditate upon you in the night watches. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings will I rejoice. My soul follows hard after you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. They shall be a portion for foxes. But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory, for the mouth of those who speak lies shall be stopped. What is this psalm missing? Oh, it's a different question. Now you don't know what to do.
A request.
Yes, there is no petition or request within this psalm. Almost every psalm that we have talked about up to this point asks for something. Asks God for something, particularly a lament. Many people and many commentaries would classify this with the laments, put it in that vein, particularly because it speaks about people that would seek to do the psalmist ill. But there's no actual request being made. At no point does the psalmist say, defend me from the evildoers, protect me from them, help me in my time of need. None of it. It is almost entirely throughout a psalm of praise and description and confidence in God. It is an unusual and outlying kind of psalm in this regard.
You think he'd ask for something if he's out in the wilderness and there's no water?
This is, yes, another key point, that he describes a situation which seems bad, which seems uncomfortable, which seems less than ideal. But yet, despite that fact, there is still no request, and it is mostly praise to God and confidence in God. It is an unusual psalm. I'm very pleased that came up so fast. That was really good. I thought that question would make me stand here and make a couple more jokes, so that's good. Despite this difficult situation, as we're saying, he's in the wilderness. He does not actually need anything from God, or at least nothing that he asks for from God, I should say. Not that he doesn't need it, but nothing that he then asks for. I cannot say how much that I enjoyed reading this psalm and realizing this and thinking about this, that he was, even in his time of difficulty and distress, supremely confident in who God was and in his relationship with God. It was a wonderful song. Plus, there's lots of lovely imagery and metaphor here that I also really enjoy. He is in a difficult place. He describes this in verse 1. Even in the superscription, we have a description of him being in the wilderness of Judah. Is that my next note? No. His physical circumstances, however, do seem to be connected to his spiritual circumstances as well. He makes this connection explicit at the beginning, and he draws a line between them. And we'll talk about this in a minute. I think I put these out of order. No, Where did I put that part about David? All right, well, this is the problem with... Oh, I thought somebody was trying to get my attention. His sojourn in the wilderness becomes a spiritual and a physical deprivation both. We see that he talks about his experience with God where in the first few verses? Well, that's where he is now, but he speaks of another experience with God. This is his current circumstance, and he is making a connection to another time and place. He is in the sanctuary. He speaks of meeting God or seeing God in the sanctuary. This would refer to the holy place in Jerusalem. This is in the temple where you go to make sacrifices and worship. Right? This is a period or a time that he is remembering where the power of God was manifest to him in some way. The phrase that he uses here, I have looked upon you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. So he is talking about a time where he was both able to see God in a much clearer and direct kind of way, in the place where he is intended and supposed to worship God when things are well. And this is also a time where he has the ability to go into Jerusalem, to be in Jerusalem. We don't get the reference to him being the king, the psalmist and the speaker of the psalm, to the very last verse. But if he is the king, if this is David, as is traditional, what point in his life might we be talking about here? I have this in my notes somewhere, but it's going to just have to come out of order. So, the trick with this one is, when is he actually in the wilderness but already king? We can think of times where he's chased through the wilderness by Saul, right? We've had some psalms about that. Saul has pursued him in various ways, and he's trying to escape, but he's not yet king, not in an official sense. Yeah? Yeah, when he flees from Absalom, that's the most likely choice. There are other reasons, and it's just not very detailed. It could be something else. It could be entirely metaphorical, right? A period of time that is being descriptive. We've talked about, the reasons that you could have a psalm of David that's not actually by David, right? They don't have the difference in their prepositions. It's context-based, and without context, you don't know whether you're saying, I wrote this one like David did, or you're saying, David wrote this one. So it's unclear a little bit. But yeah, the time with Absalom seems the most likely. He is pursued into the wilderness. He is driven out of Jerusalem. He is the king. It is a period in his life where he is, in some sense, feeling or seeing that he needs God and is dependent upon God, but is dealing with difficult circumstances. So, the verb longs in verse 1 is a unique word. It is the only occurrence of this word. Based on some other words to which it seems to be related, it appears to imply weakness. That is to say, you are needing something so much that you have grown weak from its deprivation. In the same way that you would talk about needing water, and after being deprived of water, your body begins to grow weak, or after being deprived of food, you begin to grow weak. And he talks about longing for God in this sense, that after being deprived of something or being without it, he is unable to function as well as he was before. What does he mean by the land being weary? In a dry and weary land. How is the land weary?
Doesn't bear fruit.
Yeah, desolate, barren, perhaps. Yeah, it seems to be a land that makes him weary, right? This idea, this way of phrasing a description of something as being something that it doesn't really have. He'll speak later of his lips being joyful or his mouth being joyful. Your mouth doesn't really get that way. You get that way because your mouth is doing things, or you have your mouth say joyful things or rejoice in various ways by the words that you speak, the songs that you sing. And it's kind of an imputation by giving the attribute to the inanimate object or the part of oneself, right? The land is something that makes people in it weary by traveling through it because it is desolate. Therefore, he will describe it as a weary land. And there's a number of these kinds of images in this particular psalm. There's my note about when in David's life this might have been. Why is that out of order? All right, well, Absalom. Yep, we talked about that. What is the tension between verses 1 and 2? There is a bit of a tension between these two things. We talked a little bit about what 2 was with the sanctuary. I'll just go ahead and throw this out there because I really want to get through a lot of this psalm. I don't want to be slack in my stays and be slow. The tension feels to me like the difference between where he was and where he is now. He speaks of being, seeking after God, longing for God, being deprived of God. He is driven into the wilderness, and he is remembering a time when this was not the case. He is in Jerusalem. He is able to go into the sanctuary. He is able to experience God directly as is possible for us or for them at that time, through worship of God in his dwelling place. If we consider this to be post-David, this would be in the temple. If this is David himself, this would be in the tabernacle that would be set up there, and being able to go into the holy place and make a sacrifice to God and be able to experience him in the way that was intended. And he is remembering back to this point, and it is causing this kind of, it's not really a conflict within his life, but this stark disparity between these two periods of time. And he draws this out and resolves this. He hungers and thirsts for God. He has seen God's power and glory in the past, and he wants that again. He needs that again. He is unable to live and survive without that. And he resolves and breaks this tension with verse 3. Verse 3 then talks about the fact that it doesn't matter that his life is physically deprived of the things it needs. Why? Because the kindness, the love, the mercy from God is itself better than his life is. This is one of my favorite verses. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise you. He talks about this being better than his own life. How is the goodness of God superior to life itself? In what way is God's love better than life? It's eternal. Yeah, exactly. It is without end. His life, regardless of how it is lived and what causes it to end, will come to an end. Our lives have a natural terminus, or possibly for some of us an unnatural terminus, right? One that comes to really, but it will end. That's one of the things. My father-in-law likes to joke with me when I used to work in insurance, right? That at some point, right, all the actuary tables zero out. Right? There's just, no one lives forever. You can't carry on indefinitely. And because of that, God's love becomes superior to this. Because it carries on even beyond the end of our life. It is not, there's no beginning and it has no end. It is necessary in a way that the things of life are not even necessary. It is necessary into eternity in the way that the food and the water that he is being deprived of, in the way that he is weary in this land, will have an end. These things will come to an end, one way or another. Right? What's the famous joke about the most comforting phrase from the Bible? This too shall pass. Right? These things are temporary. All the things of this life are temporary. All his difficult circumstances will not endure the way that God's love does. And therefore, even though he has this memory of being able to experience God directly in the past, of being able to have the things that his life needs, and not having them now, he is still secure in the one thing that he does actually require more than anything else: the loving kindness of God. And then this psalm becomes the natural result of this. The writing of this psalm to express this confidence, this faith in God. And I think that it is this attitude that largely informs what we talked about at the beginning. The lack of a petition. What does he actually require? The loving kindness and mercy of God, and he has it. So what is there left to ask for? What is there left to ask for? He has the one thing that he needs, the thing that is better than life itself. And so the psalm itself is composed of his praise and blessing of God, his glorying in God. It's wonderful. He drives this point home with 4. He will continue to praise God as long as he lives. This is, in fact, what I would argue is the purpose of his life and ours. We live lives to the greater glory of God. We are here to praise and glorify God. What higher or greater purpose could we possibly have? And so as long as he continues to endure, he will continue to do that for which he was made. So, will I bless you while I live? I will lift up my hands in your name. The implication could be that he is not expecting to live that long. He talks about his deprived circumstances. He talks about the needs he has. He talks about the dry and weary land. He makes a reference to the end of his life by saying, as long as I'm alive, I will continue to praise you. And it is, I think, then a powerful kind of statement that even in a difficult circumstance that may involve threat to his own life, he is still able to press forward and to put God in the primary place. If I'm going too fast, run past this verse and you want to say something, just flag me down. I don't mean to get in my soapbox too bad. He again draws the contrast and the connection between the desires of the body and the soul in verse 5. This is something of a theme. His soul, he says, will be satisfied as with the richest of foods. This is the NIV. In the ASV, my soul shall be satisfied with marrow and fatness. The connection between using the metaphor for food, for satiation. We don't necessarily have the same connection to using the word fat in English in the modern West that they would have had in this time and place. Right? When you live much closer to the edge of starvation, to food being, unavailable in a significant degree, the idea of having, delicious, calorie-intense food, fat, bone marrow, etc., is much, much, much more appealing, right? You don't get that sense of revulsion at grease or whatever it is. And so this is an important kind of connection about, in terms of expressing the satisfaction and the fullness that he experiences with God in a spiritual sense in terms that are connected to the physical body, right? Using the physical metaphor to further highlight, again, the distinction between experiencing that physically, which he is probably not now, and experiencing that spiritually, which he continues to do. He's simply saying that he is going to be satisfied as it is possible to be satisfied. To the absolute uttermost, there is no more satisfaction left to be obtained in his spiritual life, and therefore he is praising God as a consequence of this. This is, did I put this in a, yeah, this is called a hendiadys. Essentially, in the original Hebrew, they repeat the word. They repeat fat twice. And the idea there is to use that repetition as a way of emphasizing. And so, usually in English, we don't use that as a kind of linguistic tool, so they change or modify it from the literal translation. But the literal words here are simply to say, to be satisfied with fatness and fatness, with things that are satisfying and things that are satisfying. By that simple, basic repetition is used to drive home that point with emphasis. So, the word remember in 6, he speaks of remembering upon his bed and meditating in the night watches. The word is more than just simply calling it into mind. It actually has an element of dwelling on, right? The pondering over or continuing to keep it in your head and think about it from different angles. Right? So he is remembering God in the night, thinking of God in his bed, is saying that he is going to continue to dwell on this particular topic. Yes, sir?
He's in the wilderness, he's on a bed. What's the bed?
I think that, again, bed is probably metaphorical for his sleep. right? This is a way of speaking of doing this not just during the day when one might expect, but that it occupies his thoughts at all times. It is in his mind during the day, it is in his mind when he goes to sleep, it is on his mind when he wakes up in the middle of the night because there was a noise, whatever it is something that is a way of expressing that it is a constant within his experience. It's an indication of him seriously thinking, that's what I just said, deeply about God day and night. That he is doing this as a constant at all times. He has joy, again, in 7, remembering what it is that God has done for him in the past. He speaks of God having been his help. What does he mean by God being his help? What is perhaps the possible linguistic pitfall into which we, as English speakers, may fall, thinking of God as a help? Well, we'll get to the God with the wings part. That's one of my favorite things, the zoomorphism of God's wings. We've had that a couple times in recent Psalms here. But when we speak of someone as being a help to us, what are we implying about our relative status, about our relationship?
We're weak and they're strong?
Possibly, that we're weak and they're strong, but I tend, maybe this is just me, and this is something that I need to be more introspective about. I tend to think of it the other way around. If I speak of my son helping me with something, what am I saying? If someone refers to saying, oh, that'll be handled by the help, what are they saying?
Help is a servant.
Someone who's a servant, sure. A subordinate, right? If you have a helper, who's the one in charge? Right? Not the helper. Not in English. The helper is not the one who's more powerful. The one who's in charge. The one who helps you. Right? It is a thing that I am doing, me, and I have some help from this person. There's a risk, and it's not certainly always the case, because that's not where you went, and kudos. There's a risk that in English we will think of this idea of God as helping, meaning that I am still the primary one. I'm the one who is doing this on my own, and God will help me with the few things that I can't handle. Whereas the idea here in the Hebrew is that God is doing that which cannot be done by anyone else. God is the help that fills in, not where I lack gaps, but God is the primary mover of things that cannot be done by anyone else. No other God, no other being, no person. Yeah. Spiritually? Spiritually, but I think also in a physical sense too.
Not physically. It's the guys there always been spiritually helping him, guiding him. That's why I see it.
Well, I certainly think that's the case, but I think that to constrain his conception of God as a help to the spiritual sphere is to limit what he expects God to be able to do, right? That God defeats the enemies of Israel in battle in ways that Israel cannot, that God will triumph over people who are seeking to do him harm within the world. We see this in other Psalms as well. That there is a spiritual and a physical component to this. That God, in his sovereign nature over everything, the world and all that is in it, aids in a spiritual and a physical way of doing those things which we cannot do.
God is in control of everything.
Yes.
Everything. So he can use people to help him, with guidance, to help him in the situation. We don't know. Okay? They actually help my life. I don't even know men in my life. So God uses people to guide him, to help us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is both, physical and spiritual.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the key, is that God is doing both of these things. That he is and again, when he speaks of God as his help or his helper, it is not that God is assisting him in a small way by filling in the corners, but that God is the primary mover to do those things which we are unable to do. Yeah. That was the point I want to make. As you noted, the wings, there's another instance of this usage, right? A zoomorphism that is used several times. The idea of wings being spread out to shelter and to shade, to protect those underneath. The classic instance in the Gospels of Jesus speaking of that this way, quoting, I think, one of the Psalms, right? Him having longed to gather Jerusalem under his wings. Yeah. Well, again, not that God has literal wings. The metaphor, the image, is designed to call the circumstance to mind of what is being done, right? That someone in an agricultural kind of world, someone who is familiar with these things, would know what that looks like, right? That protective impulse, the desire to care for and to shelter, and then that association with what God does. God protects, shelters, defends. Yeah. In 8, he moves into describing his closeness to God. The ASV, which we read here, speaks of his soul follows hard. Most translations use the word cling. I don't like the word cling. I just think of plastic wrap, and it bothers me. But it is a good word, right, in terms of describing what's going on. The key takeaway from what that verb is trying to say is the closeness to which he is trying to stay to God. How securely and how near he is trying to remain. Following hard is just an old English phrase, meaning, right, you hear it more commonly maybe today saying something was hard on someone's heels, right? The idea that you are close behind, that you are closely there. I also like the idea of following, too. Rather than clinging, the idea being that God is the one who is going forward, right? That God is the one who is setting the path, that God is the one who is leading the way, and that we, the psalmist, and then we by extension who read and use this psalm, are trying to stay as close behind him as possible. To stay in his path, to follow in his footsteps, to remain as close as possible to him for the protection and the shelter that he can provide us. Again, I probably also just like older words and phrases because that's the kind of person I am. But he is trying to describe this closeness that he has with God in order to remain with him. I'm not sure if I put this explicitly in X note because I'm not going to move on yet, but what does he mean by the right hand of God upholding him? I'm sorry? Comfort, okay. I think so. Why specifically the right hand, though?
It's usually your strongest hand.
Well, it depends on who you ask. My wife is left-handed. She might take issue with that. But yeah, there is a... Oh, were you going to...
Yeah.
Yeah, please, no.
I was deciding on whether I should raise my hand or scratch my
You
head.
should, yeah, just call right out. Go for it.
I did read somewhere in Scripture, it's more traditional, that, I don't know where it comes from, but there is some metaphor with right and left, where right is right and left is wrong, and especially the right hand, which held a symbolism of righteousness and royalty and judgment.
Yeah, all these things are true. There is a distinct bias against southpaws in many cultures around the world for very long periods of time. And the Bible uses this in a metaphorical way. The right hand is the hand that it controls, that has power, that is the justice, right? And this is something that we get linguistically through a lot of other languages. Latin, of course, if you're familiar with that, the word sinister comes directly from the Latin word for the left, right? To be sinister is to be on the left. In French, right, we borrowed one of their words to talk about being skillful at things. What do we call it? You're adroit, which is just a direct borrowing and mispronunciation of the French word for the right. And of course, the other French word for left, gauche. Yeah, if you're gauche, it means you're socially inept and awkward, right? There's just, but my point is not to pick on left-handed people, not entirely, because it's kind of fun. But The point is why does he use the right hand? He is making a deliberate reference to who God is and God's power and control being that which upholds and sustains him. He is helped by who God is and in God's might, that God is using his strength in order to benefit the psalmist. It is a deliberate use of that metaphor. Yeah?
Who is in the right side of God? Who is in the right side of God?
Sitting at God's right hand. Yeah, Jesus sitting down at the right hand. Yeah. Mhm.
He said who's in the
Mhm.
His son. He is basically someone right with him, all has been beginning from the beginning.
Yeah, the use of right to indicate power and status, yeah, it's a common metaphor. It's a common metaphor. He speaks of his enemies being unable to triumph. And this, I think, is, again, important to revisit here. This does not actually contain a request for God to defeat his enemies. There is no request in this psalm. He simply assumes that they are going to fail. Those who seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. I'm not sure exactly what he means by lower parts of the earth. Is this a reference to the earth swallowing them up, as in the case of those that opposed Moses? Is this just simply a metaphor for the grave? Is this trying to refer to Sheol, right, the place of punishment? Regardless, though, they are going to die and fail in their efforts. Yes? Oh, no. Just get that hair out of your face. Yeah. Again, the 10 makes this very unequivocal. They're given over to the power of the sword. They are dying. They're destroyed. They're killed. His enemies do not defeat him. Those that oppose the king, the psalmist, and by extension are opposing God, who are also, more importantly, opposing God, cannot triumph. They will not triumph. Worse than this, they'll be consumed by scavengers. The older translations of this render it foxes, the ASV, the King James. Newer translations tend to render it jackals. The point being is that the scavenging beasts will consume them. Why is this worse? I say worse, but why is it worse? Yeah.
Perhaps what they will, sorry.
That's fine.
I lost my train of thought.
Sure.
Wow, no.
Flag me down when it reaches the station. No big deal. Yeah.
So, what I'm trying to say is, why it's worse is because it's basically what they try to do unto you is now done unto them, and it's spoken in earlier scriptures, especially in Psalms, I believe, and maybe a little bit of Proverbs. The Lord speaks, what your enemies shall do to you, tenfold shall be done to them. So I believe it's going back to that, and that's why this is worse. And because as they will try to hunt you down, they will be taken down by scavengers themselves.
Yeah, there's certainly an element of that. The idea of them falling into their own traps or suffering what they intend for others. But there's a specific context culturally that makes this idea essentially worse than just dying.
They don't have a grave to go to.
They don't have a grave. The Jewish notion of what's necessary and important after death entails having the body kept together, not scattered, and buried properly. That there is a real, fear is not the right word, but the real concern with the need to properly care for the dead. There's a great story in, I just thought of it, which is why it's not in my notes, in Chronicles, maybe in Kings. One of the later kings punishes some of his enemies by having them killed and then hung up in a tree and refusing to allow anyone to bury them. The idea being that they continue to suffer and be shamed after death by having scavengers come and take parts of them away so that their bones are never kept together. And what ends up happening is their mother comes and essentially camps out at the bottom of this tree in order to continue to drive away scavengers. That she endures obeying the king's stricture against taking them down simply to wait long enough for them to fall of their own accord and then defend them against being taken away. This is how seriously this kind of notion is taken. And so this threat of having scavengers tear you to pieces and carry you away was a serious and kind of terrifying idea within the Jewish culture. This was a big, big deal. And so this kind of suffering or punishment is that it will not simply end with your death. Not merely are they going to be killed by the sword, but then their bodies will be desecrated and torn apart, and they will suffer beyond the end of their own life. Let's see if we can wrap this up, get through 11 verses in one morning. This is a record for me. The first and only mention of the king appears here in verse 11. This is the only time, and it doesn't seem real consequential in a lot of ways to the rest of the psalm. The fact that it is the king. There's some argument amongst commentators about whether this could be considered even a royal psalm. Some of the psalms are classified as royal psalms as being intended during corporate worship for the king to use in his office as both spiritual and physical leader, a civil leader of the nation. Right? That the king uses them to appeal to God for help in battle against external enemies and so forth in his official capacity as king. This appears to be more incidental to the author, or even the author mentioning the king without being the king, potentially. It doesn't seem to really matter. It has a hymn midway through the verse here. The king shall rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him shall glory. Who is the him? Is that the king?
It's capitalized in my Bible.
Yeah, it's given away in a lot of texts. It's intended to be God. They tend to say, translators agree, that is actually God. It can be a little bit confusing depending on which translation you're using and the way the words are ordered. But the king rejoices in God, and everyone who swears by God shall glorify God. And this, again, becomes a contrast to verse 10 to conclude the psalm. That after talking about what the evil men who oppose God and God's chosen will suffer, those who are faithful to God will be able to rejoice and exult in the Lord. I got through the whole thing. Yes, sir.
There's a lot of metaphors and things in here that we don't get right away, even though we have a knowledgeable teacher. Did the people who were reading this understand all of those metaphors and subtleties?
Did everyone understand that? I would say as a general matter, they would probably understand more, but I don't know that these things are always explicable or easy to understand even without study for someone who is native. And the comparison I would make is we can look at modern writing or modern poetry, modern songs, modern stories, and there can be things that go right over our head until we study them, right? That they may not always be immediately obvious to us, even as if it is a contemporary work in our native language that we have, read at least once or twice even. And there can be things that will repay study and profit us there. So I would say that no, probably not entirely, but certain things would have been obvious. For example, the idea of scavengers stealing bodies away. That would have been something that just leaps off the page to someone in that time and place because it was such a significant part. It continues to be a significant part of Jewish culture even today for religiously observant Jews. And so something of that significance would. But then there are other things that are probably more subtle that, you notice it your third time through. You're like, oh, I never thought about that. Oh, that's neat. Same things will happen to us. Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
You made it all the way through.
I did make it all the way. Yeah, I don't wish to set an expectation that I cannot live up to, however. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate your being here, and we will discuss Psalm 64 next week. Thank you.